The 90s was a hugely transformational time for the WWF. Yes, from the decade starting off at the tail end of Hulkamania, moving on into a time of more athletic performers like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, and finally onto the Attitude Era. It's a time that will never be forgotten. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire decade, year by year, in the WWF in the 90s, a decade in review. The year 1990 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of film, we were first introduced to the likes of Home Alone and Goodfellas. In television, we saw the early episodes of Seinfeld. Meanwhile, in the WWF, Hulkamania was still running wild, and a new challenger emerged as the decade began. However, in many ways, it was a strange year for the promotion. Yes, it was supposed to be a traditional year, the passing of the torch from one top star to the next right as the company was moving away from the 80s and into the 90s. Of course, as much as things change though, they always stay the same. And come December, it looked very much like we were heading back towards the old status quo again. But that's not to say there weren't some big moments during the first year of the 90s, with one particularly game-changing debut being saved right for its tail end. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the promotion's first year of the new decade in the WWF in 1990, a year in review. The 1980s had been a strong period for Vince McMahon. He'd been able to successfully take pro wrestling worldwide with the advent of the Hulkamania era, combining his top star Hulk Hogan with a roster of excellent supporting characters such as Rowdy Roddy Piper, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Andre the Giant, then helping to push them over the top by bringing in mainstream names such as Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper so as to further grab the public's attention. Hell, in 1989, the company had arguably reached their creative peak when they had the Mega Powers explode, with this being the culmination of a year-long story that saw the top two babyfaces, the Hulkster and Savage, come to blows at WrestleMania 5. That said, as the new decade was dawning, McMahon, always looking for the next big thing, had begun the search for someone to replace his biggest star going forward, partially because he felt that, with Hogan now having been on top for 5 years, it was time to freshen things up. And partially because, as the champ was beginning to start a movie career, the boss was fearful that he might be left high and dry if he didn't plan ahead. Luckily then, a new star had already been blossoming for the past year or so, one that would already be familiar to fans as the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, with his high-energy entrance and comic book character come-to-life look, Vince was quick to see dollar signs everywhere the rising star went. And that was why, somewhere around the turn of the year, he made the decision to start moving the Warrior into the position to be his next top draw. And where better to coronate him than at the showcase of the Immortals itself? The only problem with this, however, was that Hogan was still the champion at that time, and WWF had never been so bold as to try to have two top babyfaces face off against each other for fear that it might leave the crowd unsure of who to cheer for. Sure, they'd done the Mega Powers blow-off the year prior, but before that bout, the Macho Man had very clearly turned heel, leaving audiences with little doubt as to who was the good guy. Still, feeling he needed to try something new, the boss felt like now was the time to try what he never had before, asking fans to make the choice as to who they would be siding with at WrestleMania 6. Before that would come, though, they would have to start setting things up at the January 21st Royal Rumble where, in the middle of the titular match, the two most popular stars in the WWF would come face-to-face for the first time, having a brief stare-off before the Warrior was eliminated with the unintentional help of the champion. More important than who was eliminated, though, was the reaction of the fans as, realizing what was being teased here, they exploded with approval, with this being enough to convince McMahon that he had made the right decision, and as such, should push forth with the big babyface versus babyface match. But that wasn't the only notable thing that happened on the night as, in the very same match, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase would set the record for length of time in the Rumble when he entered at number 1 and survived for a full 44 minutes and 47 seconds. As well as this, Mr. Perfect would put on an impressive showing himself, coming very close to winning the whole thing before he was thrown over the top rope by the Hulkster in the end. Behind the scenes, however, this was seen as a somewhat controversial decision, as Hennig had originally been planned to win the whole thing, with Hogan using his backstage power to get things changed at the last minute. Yes, even back then, the champion was using all his sway to call the shots whenever he wanted to. At the time, though, with the internet being non-existent and dirt sheets only being read by a very small minority, most fans had no idea about this. All they saw instead was the all-conquering hero coming out on top, and so they cheered this accordingly as it happened. And well, with these positive reactions, the boss must have come out of the Royal Rumble that year feeling like the whole thing had been a blow-away success. That's not to say it didn't have its downsides too, as, like many WWF pay-per-views at the time, the undercard was left severely lacking, with matches like Brutus the Barber Beefcake versus The Genius and Ronnie Garvin versus Greg the Hammer Valentine being forced to fill out the show. And before the company reached the heights of WrestleMania 6, there would be another blow as, feeling like there was no more appetite for women's wrestling in his company anymore, Vince McMahon formally deactivated the women's title on February 21st, with this making Rockin' Robin the last official champion up until the point the belt would be revived in September of 1998 and won by Jacqueline. Still, even if the girls were disappointed, this didn't give fans much pause for thought at the time, as their main focus was already on the upcoming showdown between the Unstoppable Force and the Immovable Object at the biggest show of the year. That said, that wouldn't be the only thing making WrestleMania 6 worth watching, as, on the same card, fans would get to see the culmination of a year's worth of stories that included Andre the Giant having one of his final in-ring appearances, Dusty Rhodes teaming with Sapphire to take on Randy Savage and Sherry Martel, Rowdy Roddy Piper characteristically courting controversy when he painted half his body black prior to his match with Bad News Brown, and Diamond Dallas Page getting to have a cameo appearance driving Rhythm and Blues down to the ring in his pink Cadillac. But those were all on the undercard, and it was the main event where the real story lay. Hogan versus Warrior for the title, winner take all. Of course, this main event may have never ended up happening if the Macho Man had gotten his way, however, as just a few weeks prior to the show, he'd gotten one more shot at the Hulkster during the February 23rd episode of the main event, a match that was originally supposed to see Mike Tyson appear in WWF 8 years early after he was booked to be the special guest referee. Plans for this changed though when, 2 weeks prior to this, Tyson would be knocked out by Buster Douglas in one of the biggest upsets in boxing history, with this ultimately being the reason that Douglas was brought in to officiate the match instead. But regardless of who the ref was, the result would end up the same. Hogan would retain his title and move on to WrestleMania where, in an expertly laid out bout that played to both men's limitations, stole the show and was later voted by readers of Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine to be their match of the year. And with many future WWF stars such as Edge, Christian, Lance Storm, and Renee Young all watching in attendance that night, the Ultimate Warrior would do the unthinkable by the end when he pinned Hogan clean in the middle of the ring to dethrone him as champion and start his own reign at the top. Yes, the torch had been passed, and so now, going forward, while the Hulkster left for a while to focus on his movie career and do some dates in Japan, Vince McMahon began pushing the Warrior as a top star for the 90s. Unfortunately, however, the first step in this push was to have him immediately vacate the Intercontinental title, as kayfabe WWF President Jack Tunney deemed him unable to defend both belts simultaneously. So while the new Intercontinental Champion was being decided in a tournament that eventually saw Mr. Perfect come out the winner, the World Champion entered into a feud with ravishing Rick Rude that would see the two reunite their program from the year prior. Sadly though, this never got to feel like the main event program it should have been, as, by the time it was picking up steam, Hogan had returned to the company to start his own war with Earthquake. And with fans still having their old hero there to take the shine off the new one then, the Warrior felt very much like he was playing second fiddle to the real top star, as while he was taking on Rude in a steel cage match at August 27th SummerSlam, the Hulkster was taking on his larger-than-life foe in what many saw as the true main event. Before that would come, though, WWF would have one of their most intriguing shows of that era when, as part of the working relationship with both New Japan and All Japan Pro Wrestling, they would take part in the WWF NJPW AJPW Wrestling Summit Show on April 13th in Tokyo, Japan, a show that would see the likes of Bret Hart take on Tiger Mask and Hulk Hogan face off against Stan Hansen. And while it was well received, eventually being voted the best show of the year by readers of Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter, it would still mark the only time that all three companies would ever co-promote a show together, with New Japan and All Japan's rivalry making any future attempts at this impossible. Once that was done though, it was back stateside, where WWF continued to build towards the upcoming SummerSlam pay-per-view. And in the lead up to this, fans would get to see some new faces added to the roster when, on July 16th, both the Road Warriors and Kerry Von Erich would make their debuts at a Wrestling Challenge taping, with them later to be renamed as the Legion of Doom and the Texas Tornado, respectively. And while that was going on, tragedy would strike for one Brutus Beefcake, as he would suffer a horrific injury when he was hit in the face by a parasailer that same month, with this requiring him to take the rest of the year off as he underwent facial reconstructive surgery. On a better note, however, when the night of SummerSlam finally came, fans were treated to another good show, as it was there that they would see both the Texas Tornado win the Intercontinental title from Mr. Perfect and the Hart Foundation win the WWF Tag Team titles from Demolition, all while, elsewhere, Hulk Hogan was toppling Earthquake and the Ultimate Warrior was defending his world title against Rick Rude. And as it happened, this would end up being one of the final appearances in WWF for Rude at the time, as after allegedly being told by Vince McMahon that his incredibly shredded body wasn't good enough and that if he wanted to have a future in the company he would need to take more steroids, he left to go back to WCW. And he wouldn't be the only one leaving around this time, as Jesse the Body Ventura would also cut bait after having a dispute with the boss about home video royalties for commentators, something he would later win a court case over. Setting this aside for now though, and focusing on what was happening in the ring, McMahon would start preparing for the second half of the year. A half that would see one of his top up-and-coming stars, Shawn Michaels, have to take time off to deal with a knee injury, all while, elsewhere on the show, the Texas Tornado continued to feud with Mr. Perfect over the IC title, and the Hart Foundation embarked on a lengthy run of tag title defenses. On top of this, Dusty Rhodes would continue his ongoing feud with Ted DiBiase, while Rick Martel would simultaneously be starting up a program with Jake the Snake Roberts after having temporarily blinded him with his signature cologne. This, of course, was all in the undercard though, and it was in the main event where, as usual, most of McMahon's focus lay. So it only made sense then that it was here where he used what he felt were his best ideas, having Hulk Hogan form a tag team with Tugboat to help him out in his continued wars with Earthquake, as elsewhere, the Ultimate Warrior was continuing his run on top, defending against opponents such as the Big Boss Man. That said, for as hard as the Boss had been pushing him, by this point it was clear that the Warrior just wasn't working out as the next top star the company had hoped he would be. Of course, the reasons for this are numerous and can be argued until the cows come home, with many either blaming the continued presence of the Hulkster in the main event scene, or the weak roster of challengers the champion was forced to contend against after he'd offed Rick Rude in the summer. Others, however, have laid the blame for this failure squarely on the feet of Jim Hellwig, as they felt that, when given the ball to run with, he proved that he was little more than a one-trick pony, an exciting entrance who couldn't actually do what was needed in the ring when not being carried by a far superior opponent, and who didn't have either the temperament or the work ethic required to be the next Hulk Hogan. Whichever of these arguments you subscribe to, though, the end result was the same. The Warrior just wasn't drawing, and so that was why, as the year began coming to a close, Vince McMahon began making plans to put the belt back on Hogan at the following year's WrestleMania, with him feeling then that the Hulkster would need a heel opponent to topple as he prepared to have Tugboat be the one to turn on him. Thankfully though, before Tugboat could be booked to become WWF champion, outside forces began to work their way into the wrestling industry as, with the Gulf War in Iraq picking up steam, the Boss came up with the hugely controversial idea to have perennial American hero Sergeant Slaughter turn heel and become an Iraqi sympathizer. Of course, playing off a real-life war where many people had died was seen as tasteless by a lot of fans at the time, and the results of this angle would come back to bite the company when fan interest for WrestleMania 7 the following year reached all-time lows. That said, for the time being, McMahon remained convinced that this was the way to go forward as, for the second half of the year, Slaughter would draw the ire of fans everywhere he went, with things getting so bad at one point, fearful for his safety, he would be forced to come to shows with full personal security, all while wearing a bulletproof vest. Of course, thankfully, this was never needed, but it didn't stop the turncoat aligning himself with General Adnan anyway, and entering into a feud with everyone's favorite American hero, Nikolai Volkov, in the autumn. And this would eventually see both men captain opposing teams at November 22nd's Survivor Series, with Slaughter's union of mercenaries that included Tatanka, Sato, and Boris Zukov here coming up short against the alliance of Volkov, Tito Santana, and the Bushwhackers. But that wasn't all that was happening on the show, as elsewhere on the card, the Ultimate Warrior would limp on with his title run as his team defeated Mr. Perfect's, all while after that, Hulk Hogan would once again steal his spotlight when his union of Hulkamaniacs was able to topple the quartet made up of Earthquake, Dino Bravo, the Barbarian, and Haku. And that wouldn't be the end of the night for those combatants either, as this would be the year that WWF tried out the idea of having a grand finale match, which saw the winners of all the evening's prior bouts face off in one final showdown. And while this was an interesting idea, with it ending with Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior standing tall, it never really hit it off with fans, and so the whole thing would end up being scrapped the following year. But of course, as everyone now knows, the 1990 Survivor Series would ultimately be famous for one big debut, and that was the introduction of the Gobbledygooker. Yes, we know there was a bigger one than that, but the Gooker is worth mentioning regardless, as while he may not have stood the test of time, he's remained memorable amongst fans for being one of the worst gimmicks ever created, with the tease of the giant egg being hatched at the event being built up for weeks prior, then ending in the limpest possible fashion. And part of the reason for this disappointment was that there had been so much speculation from fans about who was in the egg during the lead-up, with some even going as far as to suggest it would be a big WCW star such as Ric Flair or Sting. So when it was revealed to be Hector Guerrero in a poorly designed turkey costume, then everyone groaned, with even Mean Gene Okerlund struggling to sell the whole thing after he awkwardly stumbled about the ring with the newest roster member for a while after this. So bad was the whole thing, in fact, that McMahon would instantly recognize the failure and scrap the character entirely, with him and Dusty Rhodes allegedly joking for years after about who had the worst idea, the Gobbledygooker or the equally as infamous Shockmaster. And of course, there was another, more important debut that night, one who would go on to become one of the biggest stars in WWF history, and that was The Undertaker. Yes, perhaps no surprise debut in the history of wrestling has ever delivered as much as when the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase came out prior to his team's match against Dusty Rhodes, the Hart Foundation, and Koko B. Ware to announce that his secret entrant, who would be brought to the ring by Brother Love, hailed from Death Valley itself and was there to destroy everyone in his path. Immediately after that, and the Dead Man came out through the curtain for the first time, striking fear into the hearts of children everywhere, as Vince McMahon and Roddy Piper sold the whole thing on commentary like the devil himself had just walked into the building. Even today, in fact, 30 years on, it's still chilling to watch, and just as effective then as it was now. Little did anyone know that this character, for as cool as it was on the night, would blow away even the most optimistic expectations by lasting for a full 3 decades thereafter, remaining at the top of the card throughout and becoming arguably the greatest gimmick in wrestling history in the process, eventually going on an unparalleled near 25-year win streak at WrestleMania that would begin the following year. Hell, come the next year, he would have even toppled the mighty Hulk Hogan to become WWF champion, but that was still a while away, as Hogan would have to wait until Sergeant Slaughter had defeated the Ultimate Warrior for the belt before he could get his own shot at it. And while the Iraqi Sympathizers title win wouldn't come until 1991, the seeds for this were very much being sown as 1990 drew to an end, with him beginning to feud with the champion on the house show circuit throughout December. As far as the other titles were concerned, the year would finish up with Mr. Perfect keeping hold of the Intercontinental strap, while elsewhere, the Hart Foundation would regain their tag team titles after a phantom win by the Rockers in October would be stricken from the record books. And for all the discussion of the main event situation being in such flux as the new decade dawned, with the attempt to pass the torch onto someone new failing so miserably as the company ended up having to fall back on older, more reliable stars, perhaps the thing to be taken from 1990 is that, by the end of it, the two men who would lead the company through its next era, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, were rising up to the point of getting into title programs themselves. Hell, it would be Hart who would eventually dethrone Perfect for the Intercontinental title at the following year's SummerSlam, so even if WWF didn't know it at the time, the failure of the Warrior didn't really matter in the long run, because their future remained secure regardless. Yet for all the promise that was blossoming in the mid-card, if we're reviewing how 1990 went for WWF, it was definitely a step down from years prior, with this probably marking the point where the Hulkamania era had peaked and was now beginning its downswing. But downswing or not, any year that gave us the babyface showdown of Hogan Warrior at WrestleMania, the curiosity of a WWF NJPW AJPW Super Show, and the debut of arguably the greatest character of all time in The Undertaker can't be considered a failure. And if you're going to go back and watch any of it, we'd definitely recommend the aforementioned WrestleMania title bout and Survivor Series debuts. But those aside, don't sleep on the often great matches that were being put on by the likes of Mr. Perfect and Randy Savage, the consistently great character work shown by Jake Roberts and Roddy Piper, or the pure charisma of the Road Warriors or Dusty Rhodes, because with the steroid trial looming, most of these names would be gone within the next couple of years, and as such, the company would be forced to enter a whole new generation altogether. Yes, ultimately, 1990 can be remembered as the beginning of the end for Hogan & Co., as with the quiet rise of the mid-card and the future coming fast, things would soon change forever in the WWF. But that's a story for another day. The year 1991 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of music, Nirvana released their iconic Nevermind record. In television, Home Improvement first hit the airwaves. And in film, we were first introduced to the likes of Terminator 2 and Boys in the Hood. Meanwhile, in the WWF, 1991 was the year that saw the promotion retreat into old habits of the late 80s, relying on older, more established stars and outdated storylines. But for all the controversy the latter of these would cause, that wasn't to say there weren't changes made during the second year of the 90s. No, it's here that we first saw the sparks of what the company would become, with an increased focus on higher numbers of big shows and regular title changes, as well as the rise of the man who would carry the new generation only a few years later in Bret Hart. So, how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1991, a year in review. When we last left off, WWF was trying to bounce back from the failure of the Ultimate Warrior to draw as world champion. So, already putting plans in place to take the title off him then, they'd begun setting up Sergeant Slaughter as his next challenger. In addition to that though, in a decision which would ultimately have negative consequences as the year went on, the company had chosen to try and play off the real-life Gulf War by having Slaughter turn heel and pledge his allegiance to Saddam Hussein, something which drew nuclear levels of heel heat for the Iraqi sympathizer and even forced him to wear a bulletproof vest on his way to the ring over fears that he may be shot at. And of course, there were many who were already calling this whole angle tasteless as the new year rolled around, but WWF stuck to their guns regardless, booking the former American hero to challenge the Warrior for the top prize at January 19th's Royal Rumble. Before we would get there, though, the company would crown another new champion at a live event on January 7th when Perro Aguayo and Gran Hamada became the inaugural WWF Intercontinental Tag Team Champions. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of these belts before, well, you're not alone, because they would never have much of an impact, with them eventually getting deactivated altogether in July. But while the important belts would remain a fixture on TV, only one of them would be defended at the Royal Rumble itself, with this being the night that Slaughter mercifully put an end to the reign of the Ultimate Warrior after a screwy finish saw Macho Man Randy Savage get involved and cost the now former champ his title. And while this would see both men spin off into their own feud, elsewhere on the show, a young Shawn Michaels would continue his slow rise to the top when he and Marty Jannetty beat the Orient Express. All while, after that, Virgil would finally decide he'd had enough of Ted DiBiase's bullying when he turned on his boss after a tag match between them and the Rhodes, laying him out with his own $1 million title and leaving him for dead. Meanwhile, in the Rumble match itself, Bret Hart would put on an impressive showing after entering number 1 and lasting a full 20 minutes before being eliminated. That said, it would be Hulk Hogan who would get the win come the end of the night though, with this marking his second Rumble victory in a row as he established himself as the next contender to the WWF title in the lead-up to WrestleMania 7. That show, as it turned out, would have its own troubles behind the scenes as, partially due to the blowback from the Iraqi sympathizer storyline and partially due to general waning fan interest, ticket sales for the biggest show of the year would be disappointingly low, with this forcing the WWF to move the event from the planned Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to the nearby and far smaller Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena instead, a decision which the company would try to save face with by playing off as being the result of a bomb threat sent to the building ahead of time. Regardless of the venue though, when the show took place on March 24th, it would mark the first WrestleMania to not have Jesse Ventura as a commentator, with this, along with a new look, serving to make it feel like the first of a new era for the showcase of the Immortals. And in terms of the matches, on the undercard, the Nasty Boys would defeat the Hart Foundation for the tag team titles, while, elsewhere, The Undertaker would start his near 2.5-decade undefeated streak when he pinned Superfly Jimmy Snuka. On top of that, Jake the Snake Roberts would get the better of Rick Martel during their memorable blindfold match, just as, later on in the night, Virgil would finally get his revenge over Ted DiBiase when he pinned him after 7 minutes and 41 seconds. But that wasn't all that was going on during this bumper card, because in semi-main events, the Big Boss Man would beat Intercontinental Champion Mr. Perfect, albeit by disqualification, while prior to this, two former Intercontinental Champions would face off when the Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage settled their feud, with this eventually ending with the Warrior beating Savage and retiring him as per the pre-match stipulation in what may be the best match the former ever had. But that wasn't the most memorable part of this bout. No, it's the post-match most people think of now, as it was there where, after Sensational Sherry had turned on the Macho Man, Miss Elizabeth would come out of the crowd to help her former man, with this reuniting the couple on screen for the first time in 2 years in one of the most legitimately feel-good moments in WWF history. And if fans wanted more feel-good moments after that, they would be happy with the main event, as it was there that Hulk Hogan would end the 3-month reign of Sergeant Slaughter when he dropped the big leg on him, then pinned him 1-2-3 to become the new WWF champion. That said, if anyone thought the company would now learn their lesson and pivot away from the Iraqi sympathizer storyline, then they were dead wrong, as, after the match, Slaughter would keep the feud going when he threw a fireball in the new champ's face during a post-match interview. But while that was still bubbling away, Randy Savage would honor the stipulation of his match against the Ultimate Warrior, as he would, from there, ease into retirement, taking up a position on color commentary as, in real life, he and Miss Elizabeth began trying to have a baby. As well as that, after their failure to hold on to the tag titles at WrestleMania, the Hart Foundation would split up, with this allowing Bret to finally go off on a singles run that would see him rise to the next level before the summer was out. Despite the Hitman's popularity, though, he would not be part of the UK-only show UK Rampage 1991 on April 24th. No, there, fans would instead see Hulk Hogan successfully defend his title against Sergeant Slaughter in the rematch from WrestleMania. All well, below them on the card, the British Bulldog would get a big home country win over the Berserker, and Shawn Michaels would continue his rise when the Rockers once again beat the Orient Express. Back stateside, though, lots of fires were heating up as while WWF were moving to Titan Towers, their new corporate headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, they were simultaneously trying to manage a working relationship with Eastern Promotions, Super World of Sports, and UWF Japan, regularly sending over big stars such as Randy Savage and Earthquake in a continued talent exchange. Perhaps more importantly than this, however, July of 1991 also marked the month where former WWF ringside physician Dr. George Zahorian would be found guilty on 12 counts of illegally selling anabolic steroids, 4 of which involved distribution to WWF superstars such as Rowdy Roddy Piper and Rick the Model Martel. And while the WWF steroid trial wouldn't come for another year yet, this would mark the point that things really started to hit the fan, and many behind the scenes grew increasingly worried about what was on the horizon. In the ring, however, all the focus was on the next big show of the year that was happening on August 26th, as it was there that, in front of a much healthier crowd of 20,000 people inside Madison Square Garden, SummerSlam would take place. And on that card, big changes would come as not only would the Legion of Doom defeat the Nasty Boys to become the new WWF Tag Team Champions, but Virgil would beat Ted DiBiase again, this time winning the $1 Million title from him. As well as that, Bret Hart would reach the next rung on the ladder to the top when, in what was undoubtedly the match of the night and maybe even the match of the year, he tapped out Mr. Perfect with a sharpshooter after 18 minutes and 4 seconds to become Intercontinental Champion for the first time. Elsewhere, the rest of the undercard would be filled out with the fun jailhouse match between the Big Boss Man and the Mountie, and the final US pay-per-view appearance of Andre the Giant, with him sadly dying only 2 years later. In terms of main events that night, though, there were 2. First, there was the match made in hell where, in a 3-on-2 handicap match, Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, the latter of whom had been quietly building up a feud with a newly heeled Jake Roberts and The Undertaker on TV in recent months, would take on Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan, and Colonel Mustafa. But of course, while the babyfaces would win the match that night, no one really remembers that anymore. All they really remember instead is the fact that prior to the bout, the Warrior would demand a significant pay increase from Vince McMahon or he refused to perform, and that despite agreeing to this ahead of time, the boss felt this was done under duress, so he didn't have to honor it. That was why when the Warrior returned backstage at the close of the match, McMahon would fire him on the spot, with this ending up being the last time fans would see him until the following year. Luckily then, the other main event was a much happier one, as this was when, in the match made in heaven, Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth would have an in-ring wedding, with the real-life married couple now making it official in kayfabe too. Unfortunately though, at the reception afterwards, Jake Roberts and The Undertaker would make their presence felt when they crashed the proceedings, giving Elizabeth the gift of a live cobra and causing Savage to come out of retirement soon thereafter so as to get his revenge. But that wouldn't happen quite yet, and elsewhere, in the remaining aftermath of SummerSlam, Sergeant Slaughter would finally see the error of his ways when he turned babyface once again, with this coming after the Iraq War had ended and WWF felt there was no more juice left in the storyline. On top of that, Bret Hitman Hart would pick up another accolade when he won that year's King of the Ring at an untelevised event on September 7th, there going through Pete Doherty, Skinner, and Erwin R. Shyster en route to victory in the single night tournament. And of course, this wouldn't be his only King of the Ring win during his career. Next time he won it, in fact, it would be at a pay-per-view event, but we'll get there eventually. Elsewhere at that year's tournament, though, the only other incident of note would be the continued rise of The Undertaker, who, still remaining undefeated at that point, would mow through opponents such as Animal and Sid Justice, all before a double DQ saw him be eliminated early while still getting to maintain his aura of invulnerability. And while he was doing this, his one-time ally, Jake Roberts, was now heavily involved in a full-blown feud with Randy Savage, something which grew even deeper in intensity when, at a WWF Superstars taping in the autumn, the Macho Man would leave the commentary booth and hit the ring to confront the Snake, only for him to end up getting tied up in the ropes and bitten by a live cobra, one which had been devenomized ahead of time, but certainly hadn't been defanged. And this would lead to a gruesome scene that saw the Snake refuse to let go for an agonizing length of time as blood began seeping from the wound it had left behind, and children in the audience were left in tears. Of course, this would lead to Savage's in-ring return soon thereafter, but before we got there, WWF would return to the UK once more when they had their second special British show of the year, Battle Royal at the Albert Hall, an event which saw the Legion of Doom retain their tag team titles in a match against Power and Glory, whilst in the titular Battle Royal, hometown hero the British Bulldog would pick up the victory after last eliminating Typhoon. And the reason for these repeated tours of the UK at this time appeared to be that, while interest in their product was waning stateside, across the pond there was a hungry audience who were always desperate for more, something which would ultimately lead to SummerSlam being held at Wembley Stadium in front of a crowd of 80,000 people the following year. But back in 1991, Battle at the Royal Albert Hall would perhaps feature a moment of even greater historical importance, as it would see the first big WWF show to feature a match with Ric Flair. Yes, in a moment that sent shockwaves throughout the wrestling industry only weeks prior to this, the Nature Boy had quit WCW after a dispute with management about his direction going forward, with the company's boss at the time, Jim Herd, wanting him to cut his hair and take up a Spartacus gimmick. And as he was in possession of the WCW World title at the time of his release then, rather than give it back to them, Rick simply brought the belt to New York with him as, with Bobby Heenan now by his side, he would proclaim himself to be the real world's champion, not some fake pretender like he believed Hulk Hogan to be. And of course, this seemed to be sowing the seeds of an eventual dream match between Flair and Hogan to see who was really the best, but before that could really get going, the Hulkster would have to contend with another challenger, as at November 27th Survivor Series, he would be forced to take on the new #1 contender to his title, The Undertaker. Yes, after only a year on the roster, the Dead Man had become such a hit with fans that he was already being placed in the title picture. That said, given Hogan's reign of dominance and the fact that he'd only just won the belt back at WrestleMania, most believed he would somehow find a way to overcome the odds. In the end though, when the time for the match came on, The Undertaker continued to be just as undefeatable as his manager Paul Bearer repeatedly told everyone he was, as with a little help from Ric Flair and a well-placed steel chair, he would hit the champion with a tombstone piledriver, then pin him in the middle of the ring to start his first reign on top of the mountain. And while that was going on, the remainder of the show would be primarily made up of traditional 4-on-4 Survivor Series elimination matches, with the newly babyface Sergeant Slaughter cementing his good guy ways once again in one of these as he teamed up with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, the Texas Tornado, and Tito Santana to defeat Colonel Mustafa, the Berserker, Skinner, and Hercules. Elsewhere, the Nature Boy would hit the ring himself when he continued the TV feud he'd been brewing up with Roddy Piper around this time as the Real World's champion teamed with the Mountie, Ted DiBiase, and the Warlord to defeat Piper, Bret Hart, the British Bulldog, and Virgil. And this match, as it happened, would also further another program as by then, the Mountie had his sights set on firmly taking the Intercontinental title away from the Hitman. As for the tag team champions, the Legion of Doom, well, they'd team with the Big Boss Man to get a victory over the Natural Disasters and Erwin R. Shyster in a bout that was also supposed to feature Sid Justice on the side of the babyfaces too, until an elbow injury took him out of action at the last minute. So with Jake Roberts originally scheduled to have been the fourth member of the heel team at this point, Randy Savage began campaigning to be the new man on the other side so that he could finally get his revenge on the Snake. Ultimately, though, that would have to wait, even if only for a few days. Yes, in an interesting promotional move, the WWF had decided to try out running another big pay-per-view in 1991, one which would take place just 6 days after Survivor Series, effectively making that the go-home show to the December 3rd one entitled This Tuesday in Texas. And in kayfabe, the reason for this show existing was that after the controversy surrounding the screwy title win The Undertaker had picked up, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney announced that Hogan would be getting his rematch at this very event, and that he would be there at ringside himself to stop any further interference. But that wasn't all that was happening on this show, as it would also be here that the Macho Man finally got to come out of retirement and get his hands on Jake Roberts, in a bout that ended up being arguably the most heated one on the card, and which saw Savage absolutely pummel his opponent for the full 6 minutes it lasted. Despite getting the victory here, though, during the post-match, Roberts would get a measure of revenge himself when he not only hit his rival with 3 DDTs, but also slapped Miss Elizabeth across the face too, in a scene which caused a lot of raised eyebrows at the time and allowed the feud to continue. Elsewhere, Bret Hart would successfully defend his Intercontinental title against Skinner, while in dark matches, Ric Flair and Roddy Piper would finally blow off their beef, and the Legion of Doom would retain their tag team titles in a match against the Rockers. And of course, part of what contributed towards the Rockers' ultimate loss that night would be the growing dissension between the two, dissension which would eventually come to a head in a memorable barbershop segment that, while not aired until January 2nd, was actually filmed later that night. But of course, it was the main event that most people had paid their ticket price for, so that was where the primary focus lay for them. With that in mind then, when the Hulkster and the Phenom finally hit the ring at the end of the show, excitement was at a high. And the match that followed would give fans exactly what they wanted, as for the next 13 minutes and 9 seconds, both men would go to war. About midway through the proceedings, however, Ric Flair would once again come to ringside, seemingly intent on interfering just as he had 6 days earlier. But of course, with Jack Tunney there now, he was able to thwart this, though that didn't stop Hogan from making doubly sure by smacking the Nature Boy across the back with a steel chair himself, this causing him to fall into Tunney and leave both men knocked out. After that, and the challenger would stop Paul Bearer from interfering too, when the latter attempted to hit him across the head with his urn. And from there, Hogan would take possession of the urn himself, emptying out its ashy contents and throwing these into the face of The Undertaker, this being enough to allow him to get the pinfall and the title back around his waist. That said, this fourth reign on top for the Hulkster wouldn't last long as, given the once again controversial nature of the finish, Jack Tunney would strip him of the belt and declare it vacant days later, with him from there announcing that a new champion would be decided at the upcoming January 1992 Royal Rumble. Yes, it was a hell of a cliffhanger to end the year on, and one which did its job in getting fans to return for the Rumble the next month. That said, 1992 would end up being one of the worst years in the company's history, as it was then that the steroid trial would get going fully, with this causing the landscape to change dramatically as the era of the roided-up muscle men came to a crashing end. Luckily though, throughout 1991, two of the men who would keep WWF afloat during this dark period were already rising to the top, with Bret Hart riding high as the Intercontinental Champion and Shawn Michaels about to go on a career-defining heel run of his own. As well as that, the second year of the decade had done an excellent job in setting up what many people believe to be the inevitable showdown between Mr. WWF Hulk Hogan and Mr. WCW Ric Flair. And while this match would never end up making it past the house show circuit, at that point, fans were fully behind what they saw coming up in the main event picture. Yes, while the company had faltered earlier in the year, with the Iraqi sympathizer angle turning many people off, it seemed like by the year's end, the wheels were starting to get back on the track, as The Undertaker had become a full-blown main event force now too, all while the likes of Sid Justice were waiting in the wings for their own shot. On top of this, while fans had lost the Ultimate Warrior for the time being, they had regained an old hero in Randy Savage to make up for it, so all felt good at last. How little did we all know at the time then that over the next 12 months, everything would change. The year 1992 brought us a lot of great things. In films, we first saw Wayne's World. In music, Dr. Dre brought us The Chronic. And in the WWF, things would really start to evolve. Yes, with the steroid trial heating up and causing the landscape of the company to change forever, and whether he liked it or not, a new generation was about to dawn for Vince McMahon. But first, he would have to let go of the old one. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1992, a year in review. When we last left off, the WWF title had been vacated after the controversial finish to the Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker match at this Tuesday in Texas. And as a result of this, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney had decided that a new champion would be decided at the upcoming Royal Rumble as, for the first time in history, the belt would actually be on the line in the titular match itself. And of course that led to a lot of people vying for a spot in the match, with babyfaces and heels alike staking their claims in the weeks that followed. One of the most notable of these, in fact, was Shawn Michaels, as with the Rockers having had their own internal difficulties in the months leading up to this, he would finally turn heel on his partner in a barbershop interview segment that aired in early January, super kicking Party Marty, then throwing him through a glass window in a moment that would become the defining one of his career up until that point. Elsewhere, other feuds carrying into the big match were Jake Roberts and Randy Savage's ongoing beef, The Undertaker's continued reign of dominance, Roddy Piper's desire to become a double champion, and Ric Flair's program with Hulk Hogan. So, with all this going on, it's no surprise that the Rumble itself that night on January 19th turned out to be a 5-star classic, with many still considering it the best of all the Rumble matches to this day. Before it took place, though, the undercard would see the Natural Disasters beat the tag team champions, the Legion of Doom, via countout, while prior to that, Roddy Piper had become the Intercontinental Champion, beating the Mountie after Bret Hart was stricken with a bad bout of the flu and had been forced to drop the title days before. And this, as it happened, would mark Piper's first ever title win in WWF, with him from there entering the 30-man Battle Royal later on in the night with the intention of winning the world title too. But the story of the 1992 Royal Rumble ultimately isn't about Roddy Piper. No, it's about Ric Flair, because he would undoubtedly steal the show that night, proving once again that he was probably the best wrestler in the world at this point as, after entering at number 3, he would spend the next hour in the ring, battling out with everyone and showcasing the full extent of his endurance skills in a performance that very nearly turned him babyface. Yes, it didn't matter who he came up against. The British Bulldog, Ted DiBiase, Jim Duggan, Sid Justice. He survived them all and, on more than a few occasions, was even able to eliminate them. All while at ringside, Bobby Heenan would be putting on the performance of his career at the commentary booth. When Hulk Hogan finally made his entrance at number 26, however, most fans assumed that the party was over for the Nature Boy. How little did they know then, because when it came down to the final 3, Flair was still there, alongside the Hulkster and Justice. And in an even bigger shocker, in a moment that actually drew cheers from the live crowd, Sid would eliminate Hogan, with this causing the babyface to begin acting like a spoilt child as he from there sulked at ringside and grabbed the arm of the man who had fairly thrown him out, with this allowing the Nature Boy to sneak up behind him and dump him out too so as to win the whole thing. Yes, with a tear in his eye, Ric Flair was the new WWF champion. But while he was celebrating this backstage, the Hulkster would continue to bicker with Sid Justice in the ring, something which was done to set up a WrestleMania feud between the two. Of course, fans had originally wanted to see Flair versus Hogan at the biggest show of the year, but by then, with the match failing to draw well on the house show circuit, Vince McMahon decided to pull the plug on the whole thing, with him setting up Hogan versus Justice in a grudge match instead, while elsewhere on the card, Flair and Randy Savage would face off for the title. But the more immediate concern for him that night was the heel reaction his top star had gotten towards the end of the match, something which suggested that fans were finally tiring of Hulk's babyface antics. And that wouldn't be the only headache the boss would have to deal with over the next couple of months as, with the steroid trial really beginning to heat up, he would be forced to close down his burgeoning bodybuilding league, the World Bodybuilding Federation, something he'd started a couple of years prior in hopes of branching out from the wrestling industry. Yes, knowing that he was likely going to be indicted soon, McMahon felt like running a company full of the most roided-up men in America would be a bad look for him, so for now, the likes of Gary Stridham and Lex Luger would have to take a back seat as the boss instead refocused all of his attention on the WWF. And the next big show they had coming up was WrestleMania 8 on April 5th, where aside from the two big main events, the undercard would see Bret Hart regain his Intercontinental title in an absolutely excellent match with Roddy Piper that would see Piper do the honors in a rare pinfall loss. Elsewhere, the Natural Disasters would defeat Money Inc. for the tag team titles, while Shawn Michaels would pick up a win over Tito Santana in a match that was originally supposed to see the Heartbreak Kid defeat Marty Jannetty, but which had to be changed at the last minute after Party Marty got himself fired during the lead-up. On top of that, The Undertaker would make Jake Roberts the second victim of the streak after Roberts threatened to no-show the event unless he was released from his contract immediately afterwards, with him claiming here that he'd been promised a role on WWF's creative team prior to the event, only for this to then be rescinded once Pat Patterson returned to the company following the Ring Boy scandal. Things would go better in the first main event, however, as there, Ric Flair would defend the WWF title against Macho Man Randy Savage, with the two putting on the second classic of the night, as they spent the next 18 minutes battling it out. Come the end, though, it would be Savage who would be victorious, holding the company's top prize above his head for the second time as Ric Flair lay on the mat, a bloodied and battered mess. And in the final match of the night, Hulk Hogan would meet Sid Justice in a bout that had been promoted as possibly being the Hulkster's last leading into it. Yes, it seemed like, reading the temperature of the room in terms of the looming steroid trial and the growing number of boos he was receiving, Hogan had realized it was time to take a leave of absence from the WWF and let fans miss him for a while. That was why he planned to disappear after WrestleMania, but not before defeating Sid once and for all. Sadly though, this match is more memorable now for the massively botched ending that saw Papa Shango miss his cue to do a run-in at the end, forcing Sid to instead become the first man to ever kick out of the leg drop of doom. When Shango did finally get to the ring, however, things would get back on track, as while the two heels were laying a beat down to the Hulkster, the Ultimate Warrior's music would hit, signaling his return to the company as, much to the delight of fans, he ran down to the ring to save the babyface and send the crowd home happy. Yes, even if Hogan were going to be gone for a while, at least the fans had the Warrior back, and so all seemed right with the world at the close of the show. Off-screen, though, concerns were growing as, despite the event having been promoted as a huge one, ticket sales were soft for the second year running, with an estimated 15,000 tickets having to be given out for free prior to the show so as to fill up the stadium. And to make matters worse, not only were Hogan and Jake Roberts gone, but both Roddy Piper and Sid Justice would also take hiatuses soon after WrestleMania, with this marking the first of many waves who would be missing come the end of the year. Still, the company had to push forward anyway, as they had another UK show coming up in April, UK Rampage 1992, that would see the British Bulldog once again play the hometown hero, defeating Irwin R. Shyster in the main event, while elsewhere on the card, Randy Savage would defend the WWF title against Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart would retain his Intercontinental title against Rick Martel. And by this point, it was becoming clearer and clearer to WWF officials that, whenever they crossed the Atlantic, the Hitman was being treated like arguably their biggest star, something that the boss would take careful note of when he had to make a big decision later in the year. But it wasn't just Bret that the British loved. No, they were going wild for everyone as it turned out, and that was part of the reason why, with fan interest in the US continuing to wane, Vince McMahon decided to take his second biggest show of the year on the road, and for the first time ever, hold a major WWF pay-per-view outside of North America. Yes, on August 29th of 1992, SummerSlam would emanate from Wembley Stadium in London, England, with the rafters being packed here so as to hold a crowd of 80,000, WWF's legit largest attendance ever at that point. And hoping to equally play to markets on both sides of the pond then, the company would feature another double main event that night. One for the US fans that would see Randy Savage defend the WWF title against the Ultimate Warrior, and one for the UK fans that would see Bret Hart and the British Bulldog battle it out over the Intercontinental title. But that wasn't all that was happening on the stacked card that night, as, in the opener, the Legion of Doom would receive a Road Warrior-worthy pop as they came out to lay waste to Money Inc. All well, following this, Nails would establish himself as a threat to watch out for by beating Virgil, and Shawn Michaels and Rick Martel would go to a double countout. As well as that, the Natural Disasters would defend their tag team titles against the Beverly Brothers, and The Undertaker would pick up a win over Kamala. That said, it was the main events that people really cared about, and the first of those would come when the Macho Man put the WWF title up for grabs in his bout with the Ultimate Warrior, a match that had slowly been building up during the months prior as, after returning to the company in April, the Warrior had immediately set his sights on reclaiming the belt that had once been his. But of course, at that point, Ric Flair was still involved in the title picture too, as with his rematch clause in place, he'd spent the spring trying to get it back from the man who had beaten him at WrestleMania. Ultimately though, the Nature Boy would not be able to win any of these matches, and so the Warrior was considered next in line, something which only served to infuriate the former WCW star. So, hoping to get in the heads of both men then, Flair and his executive consultant, Mr. Perfect, would attempt to sow the seeds of doubt ahead of the WWF title match, with them claiming that one of the participants had agreed to accept the managerial services of Perfect going forward, and that their identity would be revealed on the night of SummerSlam itself. And while Savage and the Warrior would try to put this aside when the time came for the bell to ring, it was clear to see that it was on their minds, as each worried about whether they would be getting screwed over come the end of the match. Still, with the company's top prize on the line, they battled it out as best they could, trading the advantage back and forth until, around the halfway mark of the bout, Flair and Perfect would walk down to the ring, from there seeming to help out the challenger, only to then lay him out once the referee had been knocked out too. So by this point, realizing that they were only there to cause trouble and had no interest in recruiting either man, the Macho Man would attack Flair, only for the Nature Boy to get the better of him here when he hit him across the leg with a steel chair at the ringside area. And this left the champion unable to get back in the ring before the 10 count, meaning that the Ultimate Warrior would win the match but would not win the title as it had happened on a countout. And of course, fans weren't happy with this ending of the night, given its inconclusive nature, but luckily for them, there was an even bigger match to come, as after that, fan favorite Bret Hitman Hart would defend his Intercontinental title against hometown hero the British Bulldog, in a match that was designed to send the live crowd home happy. What they didn't realize, though, was that, in the days prior to the bout, the Bulldog had spent most of his waking hours doing crack cocaine with Jim Neidhart, and so had forgotten everything he and Bret had planned for the match. And were it a lesser wrestler in the ring with him then, the whole thing would have fallen apart. Luckily, though, the Hitman was already by this point approaching GOAT status, and so he was able to carry Davey Boy through the whole thing, playing the subtle heel and putting on what many still consider to be a career-best performance as, by the end of it, the hometown boy would get the pin and the Intercontinental title to an absolutely massive pop. Yes, it was a crowning moment for Davey Boy Smith, and in a better world, this would have been his springboard to the top of the card. Sadly though, his drug issues would see him be fired not long after this, with the Ultimate Warrior quickly following him out the door too, as Vince McMahon began to tighten up his policies with the steroid trial drawing ever nearer. And the Warrior's exit also required a last-minute change in storyline as, with him and Randy Savage already being booked to face off against Ric Flair and Razor Ramon at the upcoming Survivor Series at that point, it would mean a familiar figure would have to come out of retirement and thus turn babyface once more in his absence. Before any of this would happen though, further big changes would be on the horizon for the WWF, because at a TV taping in Hershey, Pennsylvania on September 1st, the Macho Man would drop the WWF title to the Nature Boy. This reign, though, would only be a temporary one, as it turned out, because at a live event in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan just a month later on October 12th, Bret Hart would pin Flair in a surprise victory to start his own first run with the top prize. Yes, with Hulk Hogan seemingly gone for good by now, and the Ultimate Warrior no longer being a fallback option, Vince McMahon had been forced to decide who his next top babyface was going to be. And in the end, it came down to a short list which allegedly included names like the Texas Tornado, Crush, and even Tatanka. Based on how much support he was getting from European fans though, and how well he could perform in the ring, the boss chose to go with Hart instead, with this ushering in the beginning of a new, higher work rate era for the company's main event scene going forward. But the title win itself wouldn't be seen by fans for a while afterwards as, with it not happening at a TV taping and this being before the age of camera phones, footage was hard to come by. So when the Hitman showed up at a Superstars taping as the new WWF champion soon after, fans were confused but went with it anyway, happy to accept them as their new top guy. But that wasn't the only belt that was changing hands around this time as, with the British Bulldog no longer able to keep up his commitments as Intercontinental Champion, he would be forced to drop it to Shawn Michaels on his way out the door. And this would set up another interesting match for the upcoming Survivor Series show as, once again, the company would book a champion versus champion match, this time with only the world title on the line, and featuring the two superstars who would go on to carry the company for the next few years. Of course, even that wasn't the original plan though, as the plan had originally been for HBK to defend his IC title against a returning Marty Jannetty at this show. Before that could happen, however, Party Marty would predictably get fired again, with this keeping up his reputation as someone who just couldn't get out of his own way to let himself succeed. So while Bret and Shawn were getting ready to have their first Survivor Series match when the time for the show came on November 25th, the undercard would feature the Big Boss Man facing off against Nails, a purported former prisoner with a voice modulator who claimed that the babyface cop had inflicted police brutality on him while he was behind bars. And this would see the two fight it out in a nightstick on a pole match where, after 6 minutes, the Boss Man would send the jailbird packing. And unhappy with both this result and his apparently small payout after the match, Nails would confront Vince McMahon in his office afterwards, with the whole thing quickly getting heated from there, as he would allegedly try to strangle the boss, with this causing him to abruptly get fired from the company. Thankfully then, the next few matches wouldn't end in such high drama, as while Tatanka was keeping his undefeated streak alive with a win over Rick Martel, Randy Savage was introducing his new partner, Mr. Perfect, who, after having had a confrontation with Ric Flair on the November 16th episode of Primetime Wrestling, had once again turned to the side of the good guys. And with this new alignment in place, both he and the Macho Man would pick up a disqualification win over the Nature Boy and Razor Ramon that night, all while elsewhere, The Undertaker defeated Kamala in the company's first ever coffin match. New signing Yokozuna continued to build momentum as a monster heel when he pinned Virgil in just 3 minutes, and in the lone 4-on-4 Survivor Series elimination match of the night, the Natural Disasters and the Nasty Boys would defeat Money Inc. and the Beverly Brothers. Yes, WWF had clearly decided by this point that a card filled with elimination matches wasn't a big enough draw anymore, and so that's why, from here on in, Survivor Series would focus more on singles bouts. And the best singles bout of the night was still to come as it happened, because in the main event, we would get to see the WWF Champion and the Intercontinental Champion square off in a match that showed fans what the future of the company was going to be. And while this one is often forgotten in favor of their far more famous Survivor Series match from 5 years later, it was absolutely the better of the two from an in-ring perspective, with Bret getting to establish himself as a strong champion here, all while HBK proved he could hang in the main event scene. Of course, by the end it would be the Hitman who would retain, closing out the last big show of the year as the company's new top star. But with big new challengers such as Yokozuna on the horizon, he would have his work cut out for him if he wanted to remain in that position going forward. But that was news for 1993, because in terms of 92, things had drawn to a close. And what a transformative year it had been for WWF. It had begun with a main event scene dominated by the likes of Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, and Sid Justice, and had ended with that very same scene now being filled with performers such as Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Yes, a lot of this was due to the upcoming steroid trial that saw the bigger physiques of yesteryear begin to get phased out and a new, more athletic style become the focus. But that shouldn't negate the fact that Bret and Shawn absolutely earned their spot, as by then, they were arguably the two best wrestlers in the entire company. So while it may not be the most fondly remembered year in WWF history, it's probably one of the most important, as it showed that, when forced to make a change, McMahon was still able to adapt, and while financially there were tough times ahead for the company, the in-ring product was, in some ways, about to get better than it ever had been before. The year 1993 brought us a lot of great things. In the world of television, we saw Season 1 of Frasier. In film, True Romance first hit theaters. And in the WWF, we saw a roller coaster year full of highs and lows. Yes, if 1992 was the year where the last dying embers of the Hulkamania era were supposed to have burnt out, then 1993 was supposed to represent the shift into a new generation for WWF. And while in many ways this would happen, with smaller, more athletic stars solidifying their spot on top of the card and new weekly TV shows making their debut, sometimes letting go of the past is a hard thing to do. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWF in 1993, a year in review. When we last left off, a new WWF champion had been crowned in the form of Bret Hitman Hart, someone who, with his ability to put on a different, more technical style of match to what fans were used to, had been able to capture fans' hearts in the wake of the loss of prior big names like Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, Jake Roberts, the British Bulldog, and Sid Justice. And it wasn't long then before the company had started to adapt around their new top star with similar styles of matches, something that was double important now, as on January 11th, Vince McMahon would debut his latest creation, Monday Night Raw, a weekly TV show that would air on primetime from the Manhattan Center and which would break new ground for televised wrestling by offering more than mere squash matches. Instead, this one would regularly push storylines forward and would feature early classics such as Mr. Perfect and Ric Flair's Loser Leaves Town match, the very match that ended up being the Nature Boys' swan song to the company for the time being. It would also be the show that saw a huge return in the wake of an even huger loss just a month later, but before we would get there, the Royal Rumble would take place on January 24th. And as one of the more highly anticipated shows of the year by this point, WWF felt the need to load this card up, with it finally featuring the long-awaited showdown between Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty over the Intercontinental title. But of course, despite managing to keep his job for long enough to get the bout in the ring this time, in the end, HBK was on too much of a roll to be defeated on the night, with him hitting his rival with a super kick after just over 14 minutes to put the whole thing to bed. And as he was doing this, elsewhere on the card, the Steiner brothers were making their WWF pay-per-view debut a successful one when they picked up a win over the Beverly Brothers. All while, in the WWF title picture, Bret Hart was racking up another title defense as he was able to get the better of his opponent, Razor Ramon. After that, fans would get introduced to another new face when Lex Luger, who had previously been employed by Vince McMahon's short-lived World Bodybuilding Federation, would make the jump back over to the world of wrestling when he was unveiled under the new gimmick name of The Narcissist by his manager going forward, Bobby Heenan. That said, the real main event of the night, though, was the 30-man Royal Rumble match where, this year, an added stipulation would see the winner get a shot at the WWF title in the main event of the upcoming WrestleMania, a stipulation which proved to be so popular that it would end up continuing on to the present day. So, with even more on the line than normal then, every contestant in the match gave it their all, hoping to book their shot against the Hitman at the Showcase of the Immortals. Despite some impressive efforts though, including a 1 hour, 1 minute and 10-second run from Bob Backlund and another dominating performance from The Undertaker, it would be Yokozuna who would come out the victor by the end, last eliminating Macho Man Randy Savage as he from there set his sights on taking down the champ in April. Yes, the WrestleMania World title picture seemed set, but as we mentioned before, a big return and an even bigger loss would come before then that would throw a spanner in the works as, on January 27th, the wrestling world would sadly say goodbye to one of its biggest stars, both literally and metaphorically, when the legendary Andre the Giant passed away at just 46 years old, his death ultimately coming as a result of congestive heart failure. So to honor the man who had done so much for the company then, later that year on March 22nd, Andre would become the inaugural inductee into the WWF Hall of Fame. Elsewhere, though, the pain of this loss would be numbed somewhat for fans when, on the February 22nd episode of Raw, Hulk Hogan would make his return to the company, from there teaming up with his real-life friend Brutus the Barber Beefcake as the two got involved in a program with Money Inc. And this would lead to the biggest show of the year on April 4th where, in the parking lot of Caesars Palace on the Las Vegas Strip, WWF put on a show that was considered the worst WrestleMania ever by many at the time. Of course, being in such a small location compared to other years didn't help with this either, as with interest at an all-time low, the boss struggled to create any meaningful buzz around the show, even with the in-ring return of the Hulkster taking place. And part of the reason for this was that, for the most part, the card was pretty lacking, with Shawn Michaels having probably his worst WrestleMania match against Tatanka, all while elsewhere, Razor Ramon was handing Bob Backlund his first ever pinfall loss in WWF, Lex Luger was putting on an unimpressive performance against Mr. Perfect, and The Undertaker was continuing his undefeated streak with an absolute stinker disqualification victory over Giant Gonzalez. That's not to say that there weren't bright spots though, as the show did feature the debut of Jim Ross on commentary. And on top of that, Hulk Hogan would indeed make a successful return when he and Brutus Beefcake were able to get the upper hand on Money Inc. But while this match took place on the undercard, coming out of the show, Hogan would remain the name on everyone's lips as, after Yokozuna was able to defeat Bret Hart to win the WWF title in the main event, the Hulkster would come out to challenge him to an impromptu match, from there, defeating the heel in just 22 seconds to start his 5th reign on top. Yes, it may have sent the crowd home happy on the night, but by the next day it was already clear how short-sighted of a move this had been, as not only had the Hitman and Yokozuna, two stars of the future, been sacrificed to make way for more Hulkamania, but Hogan was only planning on returning to the company on a short-time basis anyway, as with the steroid trial continuing to heat up and his movie career still burgeoning, he felt he couldn't commit full-time. So the plan initially then was for Hogan to drop the belt to the Hitman at the upcoming SummerSlam pay-per-view, putting the new generation over strong as he then moved on to other ventures. Before that could happen though, the Hulkster would have a change of heart, allegedly telling Bret that he was out of his league and that he would only drop the belt to Yokozuna instead, something which understandably left the Canadian feeling disrespected. Before that title change would happen, however, the 5-time champion would take the belt over to Japan, where he would wrestle the at-the-time IWGP champion, the Great Buddha, in front of 55,000 fans at the Fukuoka Dome, there displaying a previously unseen level of technical in-ring skill that saw him wrestle in a catch-as-catch-can style. After the match, though, he would court controversy when he declared the WWF title to be nothing more than a toy, as what he really wanted was the IWGP title, something which didn't leave Vince McMahon happy back over in America. But he had his own problems to deal with at this point, because the WWF were on another tour of the UK, attempting to capitalize on their popularity there with an underwhelming show that saw Crush defeat Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger defeat Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And once back in the States, they would try to revive interest by having a number of title changes take place on house shows,